Hello, Rune Scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the Modern Erilar. I introduced a couple of Irish runic finds back in episode 10 when I discussed dotted or stung runes, and you asked for a deeper dive. So today, let's look at runes in Ireland. Only 18 runic inscriptions or texts survive from Ireland, so it's difficult to make definitive conclusions about trends in Hiberno-Scandinavian writing, but we can try. 17 of the 18 finds are Viking Age, dating to between 950 and 1125 of the Common Era. With 13 inscriptions, the largest number of runic finds have been recovered from Dublin, a Viking town continuously inhabited from about 841 of the Common Era up to today, and the site of a substantial trading center. Vikings founded similar but smaller settlements at Waterford, Wexford, Cork, Limerick, and we find evidence for scattered occupation at places like Viking Age Ireland off the southwest coast in County Kerry. Some version of Old Norse was the dominant language in the towns that the Vikings founded in Ireland, but given the sparsity of the runic evidence in Ireland, we haven't been able to conclude much about the language beyond that. Barnes, Haglund, and Page have held that the evidence from the various rune forms, or graphemes, that might indicate a distinct linguistic orientation within Ireland towards either Old West Norse or Old East Norse are themselves mostly either indistinct or ambiguous. Some inscriptions seem to be purely Danish, and others are purely Norwegian. There's only sparse and inconclusive evidence for any Gaelic influence on the language recorded in the inscriptions. So Dublin, at least, seems to be less tied to specific Scandinavian traditions than other Atlantic colonies like that on the Isle of Man may have been. So why do we conclude that? Out of the little evidence that we do have, we can observe some general rules or a lack thereof, provided we remember that this isn't a big corpus. We observe an equal number of short-twig and long-branch T runes. We have both short-twig and long-branch S runes, and there are twice as many long-branch as short-twig. There are only long branch forms of H, B, and M, and only short twig forms of N and the short A vowel. However, we can tell that no single inscription contains a completely short twig rune set. Inscriptions IR4 and IR6 may both be fully long twig, but both are poorly preserved. Inscription IR12 is definitely fully long twig and with a dotted or stung rune, which you can see toward the end of this inscription here. Speaking of stung runes, a shocking 6 of the 18 inscriptions and texts incorporate dotted runes. The dotted seems to appear first on this pretty securely dated inscribed antler from the year 1000, around the same time that the Danes began to use dotted or stung runes. The use of this stung rune specifically might indicate Danish influence behind this inscription because Norwegians were starting to use the ir final R rune for the Y sound by this date. Stung is appears in 4 inscriptions, all of which tend to be later than the middle of the 11th century, so possibly after Diarmaid MacMallamhu conquered Dublin and the city became subject to an Irish High King in 1052 CE. As of early 2024, the latest inscription with a stung is IR17 from Temple-Bar West, which Lindsay Simpson dated to the early 12th century, though the actual interpretation of its meaning is obscure. Stung appears in a mid-11th century inscription and was used in a name where we would normally expect a G sound. Outside Dublin, we see similarly mixed Futharks. For example, in Killaloe, inscription IR2, we observe a short twig N and A short twig T, but long branch S forms, a mixed inscription. Then at Beginish on the Ivory Peninsula, we can observe short twig N, S, and T runes, but a long branch M, even though the majority of the runes are poorly preserved. This mix of Futharks in Ireland could indicate either mixed Scandinavian settlement or, as Barnes suggests, too much rigidity in our own classification of Futharks between short twig and long branch, when the historical reality may have been much less formally delineated than some of the 20th century runologists would lead us to believe. We do have a single find that gives us a full rune row. This is from Dublin on a barrel stave reused as a rune stick, which dates to the very end of independent Scandinavian kingship in Dublin. There are two faces showing what look like marks from different knives and possibly different people carving the Futhark. The only real differences between the two faces are the one U rune has a longer and more curved twig than the other, the inclusion of a strong point at the end of the short twig S, which you can see here, and the amount of space between the arcs of the B. So ultimately they're very similar and the forms are the same. What is currently the most recent set of runes, the latest one that we have in Ireland, is medieval. A Middle Irish manuscript called In Labor Ogham, or the Book of Oghams, which was transcribed sometime between 1300 and 1500. It consists of collections of Brethir Ogham, which are two-word kennings explaining the meaning of the characters of the Irish Ogham script, very much like the lines of the various rune poems do, though it does not contain a text that we could call an Irish rune poem. This version shown here is one of two currently stored at my alma mater, Trinity College Dublin. There is another version at the Royal Irish Academy called the Book of Ballymote, one at the National Library of Ireland, and another at the British Library. Page 33 in this version and the verso of folio 170 in the Book of Ballymote contains two partial rune rows. These are explicitly labeled as Ogham, Lochlin, Anso, which means the Ogham of the Scandinavians here. Of the surviving examples, the Book of Ballymote is the most complete surviving Irish rune row that dates to later than the Viking Age rune row in inscription IR11. The equation of ogham and runes in the medieval Irish mind does make some sense, as both were forms of writing used in prior centuries, which may require translation by those who studied what were then the historical texts of the time. And runes did indeed coincide with lines written in the Ogham script, in which the Old Irish language was written, sometimes within the same monument. A stone cross fragment from Killaloe in County Clare dates to between the late 10th and mid 11th centuries. I've already showed you the runes here. These ones appear on its north face and read simply, Torgrim raised this cross. The ogham on the east face reads Beendactar Torgrim, or a blessing on Torgrim. And because the texts name the same person, we can reasonably assume that the ogham and the runic inscriptions could be contemporary. Comparing various versions of the Book of Oghams also thankfully gives us the medieval names for the runes in Ireland. They're in this section here, and many of them are going to be familiar. While we can't be sure that these exact names were used by Hiberno-Scandinavians during the Viking Age, these names are the closest we can get to any potential differences between Ireland and Scandinavia. If we match up these names from the Book of Oghams with what Michael Barnes called an idealized Irish Futhark, we can arrive at a potential Irish Younger Futhark rune row, with the caveat that we just don't have a ton of evidence. So, the names and shapes used in Ireland for the runes are as follows. Thea for F, R for U, but unlike in Scandinavia, we have no examples in which this rune was used for a W or a V sound, really. The name Tors could possibly indicate that this rune had evolved from a TH sound to a harder T, which aligns with a similar evolution in Scandinavian medieval pronunciation, or it could just be an Irish interpretation of the spoken language. Or appears in several forms. It could be used as a long O vowel, a nasal A vowel, or a possible intermediate rounded vowel appearing in inscription IR1 in the name Domnall. Rythe, Caun, and Hagel are again going to be similar to what we've seen. Noun may be a misrendering of Nauth, but we can't be quite sure yet. Ease, R, and Sol again are similar, and notice that the name R has repeated. Dior is transliterated in the text as a D sound rather than a T. Tors is transliterated as T, and the word djur in Scandinavian languages like Swedish means animal. But it's still uncertain whether we're dealing with an Irish interpretation of the name Tyr, which would be the Scandinavian name for this letter, or an evolution of the sound. Still unclear. Bergan, Man, Langur, which may have been a miswriting of the Laugur that is its Scandinavian name. In inscription IR12, this rune definitely represents a palatal R, which sounds more like a J sound. Inscription IR8 may also use it as a palatal R, but IR11, with its two Futhark rune rows rather than actual words, doesn't give us any phonemic clues as to the pronunciation of specific runes. Otherwise, the graphemes or the rune shapes of IR11 could indicate a Western Scandinavian influence, where the Ir rune had already morphed into a Y, a sound early in the Viking Age. This would line up with what the Book of Oghams tells us, which gives the transliteration of the last letter of the Futhark as E. These three dotted runes also appear within Irish runic inscriptions, but like stung runes in other late versions of the Younger Futhark, they are not separate runes within the Irish rune row given in IR11, and they are not listed as having separate names in the Book of Oghams. If you visit the images of the various copies of the Book of Oghams, you'll notice a couple extra rune forms in the manuscript that I haven't mentioned. One that looks like a backwards caun, another that could be a large format rendering of a short-twig S that terminates in a circle, just the same size as the rest of the runes, and another that looks sort of like a pentagon with a point downward. Thorgerda has done an analysis of what we might be looking at here in terms of scribal errors that could have rendered certain runes backwards, but even Gerda is uncertain about what some of these signs may actually indicate. I hesitate to say that these signs were definitively used as runes because even though it's medieval, the Book of Oghams is a secondary source that interprets then historical texts rather than itself being written in runes. We do know from place name evidence around the medieval Dublin suburbs that a group of people distinctively identified as Easterners did still live in the area. But we don't have any runic finds that show that this was a living tradition in the High Middle Ages, the way that we do in areas like Greenland. I'll point you to Gerda's article in the further reading section if you'd like to decide for yourself. Really, though, you can't go wrong with the IR11 rune rows or the idealized Futhark that Barnes et al. Give in the Runic Inscriptions of Viking Age Dublin volume if you want the firmest possible Futharks for Ireland to use for yourself. So, let's tackle another request for a deep dive in our next episode. I'll do a deeper dive into the runes from Orkney. Thank you for reading the runes with me, the modern Erilar.